sometimes I'll look back and say, whoa, I've been doing this for 20 years already.
So I think Terry's endeavor, like many modern makers today, is to bring that work of art and that great piece of equipment to students and to musicians.
I'm very cognizant of the fact that it's going to be used and loved for 200 or 300 years.
Terry Borman is a violin maker with an international impact on the violin world. From his workshop in Fayetteville, Arkansas, he builds instruments by hand for world-renowned musicians all over the globe. But after graduating high school in 1974, the journey from his hometown of Chicago to the Ozark Mountains can only be described as unconventional.
I think within a day or two of graduation, I drove away, and I ended up just driving around the West mostly for about a year, going from place to place, and whenever I would get somewhere, I would find a job and earn some money, stay there a week or two, move to the next place. I lived in Greeley, Colorado for a while, and I found a migrant worker shack. It didn't have any water or anything, but it had a little pump house, and it had an outhouse, and that was actually nice because it was really quiet. Winters were brutal, but I had a potbelly stove, and it made it nice. And you know, me and my dog, we did pretty well. At the time, my brother was living in southern France, and so I thought, well, I'll just go visit my brother for a little bit. And so I bought a one-way ticket and showed up at my brother's door. I'd been doing that throughout high school, and so wherever he was, I would, take off and show up. And he said, "Does Mom know you're here?" No, I don't think so. Being an illegal alien in France and it was expensive living there at the time. So I ran out of money fairly quickly. And so I found myself with, the North Africans and, all the other illegal aliens working odd night jobs. So we were the ones running around avoiding the police, putting posters up for concerts. But then because I was American and I knew, my brother had this little band, somebody's electric guitar broke. The assumption was that since I was American, I must have worked at Fender or Gibson at some point in my life. All Americans do that. So I started repairing electric guitars and things, and somebody would drop the guitar off, and I would go running out the back door and go to the library and find a book on how to repair it, come back, and it actually worked fairly well.
After repairing guitars for his brother's band, Terry opened his own instrument repair shop in 1981 in Montpellier, France. Word of Terry's work began to spread throughout the area. One day, world-famous flamenco guitarist Manitas de Plata came to Terry's shop to get a guitar repaired.
So I was working on one of his guitars, and he came to pick it up, but he got there a little bit early. So he shows up in his Rolls Royce, and he parks, and I'm not there, so he just goes and sits down in the plaza, and he starts just having a little impromptu concert. And I got back, and there were hundreds of people that were standing around because this was a big deal. Manitas de Plata is playing, a free concert. That's when I realized it doesn't work very well being an illegal alien with that high of a profile. And then I heard about this an Australian that lived way out in the country, which is perfect for illegal aliens.
After leaving Montpellier, Terry sought out well-known lute maker Stephen Murphy to serve as an apprentice.
Actually, I don't know if he was looking for an apprentice, but an apprentice showed up. His shop was in a building that was built in 1600s, and you know, it was cold and damp, and I loved it. It was great. But then I realized that even though the lutes, they seem round, but again, they're like guitars. There wasn't any carving or sculpting or anything like that. So I made my first violin, and I thought it was pretty good. It was ridiculously terrible. But I thought it was pretty good. You know, that first instrument, I didn't even have a violin in the shop to, know what it was supposed to look like, really. So.
Terry traveled throughout Europe and the United States to find the right violin-making school. He visited schools in Germany, England, Italy, and France, until finally deciding to attend the Violin-Making School of America in Salt Lake City in 1984.
I was really lucky in that my main teacher there was fantastic. He was really good. You know, he could cut things down so you realized it quickly, which is a much better, much faster way to learn. His name was Jeff Robinson. I remember once I brought something up to him and was really proud of it. And he looked at it and said, "Well, this is the beginning of a long, slow decline." And at the time I was kind of devastated. But in retrospect, I completely, totally appreciate his teaching style. It really didn't allow me to get sloppy and lazy. It's really hard work. And as soon as you become at all complacent, it's highly competitive. And you get a little bit lazy, and there are plenty of people that are, scrambling up the slopes that would be more than happy to take your position. I got lucky early, on after graduation. I started selling instruments to well-known people, and I thought, well, that must mean that I'm good. Within a year or two, I sold an instrument to a very high-profile soloist named Jamie Laredo. That was a big splash. That was a big deal.
Terry uses the Cremonese style of violin making, which was developed in the Italian city of Cremona in the 17th century. This style was standardized by some of the most well-known makers in history, including Niccolo Amati, Antonio Stradivari, and Joseph Guarneri.
I think it's one of the few instruments that has been around for a really long time and then did not necessarily change as much as other instruments. That really makes it unique, because you have this long tradition of repertoire that stretches all the way into the Baroque period, which is not the case with many other musical instruments.
Building in the Italian style, you have a lot more flexibility. I can move things around. You know, if I decide I want something to be a millimeter bigger or 5 millimeters longer or something, it's very easy to modify as you're going.
Well, I think that there is not really any original style, because I'm sure there were different centers of violin making, and each of them was competing for being the best. And I think this oftentimes these claims of originality and authenticity have to do with marketing, right? Because you want to claim that your style is the best.
The school that I went to, they taught the Germanic style, and it took me years to unlearn that and go back to the original style that I much preferred, because it allowed a lot more freedom. If you look at a lot of these other schools of instruments, if you have a model or a mold, you can make 50 instruments on that mold, and they're going to look super similar, which to me is super boring. I'm a very traditional maker. That's my training. I like doing more of the work by hand because I get to know the wood better before I get to the important parts that I need to do with the wood.
I'll have to go over this 3 or 4 times to get the depth that I want. It's very boring work.
And so, every piece of wood's going to be different. So if I get more comfortable with the piece by working it more as opposed to a machine working it, it just gives me, I think it gives me a little bit better understanding of what kind of results I might get or what I might need to do to get those results. That's one of the things about... I pretty much remember significant details about every instrument. I can even remember, psychological breakdowns during some instruments because of difficulties I ran into or things that I thought were going to be super terrible and no good and very bad that worked out really well.
In 2003, Terry was commissioned by one of his clients to build an exact replica of a 17th century violin. This turned Terry's interest toward the science of acoustic radiation and its connection with stringed instruments.
Then I got into acoustic radiation, analyzing the sound radiation from the instrument body. Modal analysis is used to study vibration patterns. I would do modal analysis of these violins, these really great violins, to see how the great ones vibrate and the vibration patterns and things like that. And then you could look at the crappy ones and see what they're doing and, compare them. And so you can see how the different thicknesses and the densities are affecting those vibration patterns. The higher it is, the deeper the red. On my own instruments, when I get an instrument back that I don't like the way it sounds, It used to be that you'd take it apart and you'd go in and you'd maybe find the thick areas or the thin areas. This cello is really thick right in this section, which is where the sound post is. Kind of change things around. I don't do that anymore. It's much more targeted. I can do a modal analysis and I can see which areas are not responding the way I would expect them to, and which areas which are over responding. And so, you know, it's really focused on smaller areas rather than blanket, maybe this is going to help kind of thought process.
Dr. Ergene Kong is a violin professor at the University of Arkansas. Once Terry is finished with an instrument, she is the first to get her hands on it.
So I play many excerpts just to see how responsive it is and how powerful it is. You can have a very empty, loud sound that can almost sound strident. You can have something that's very meaty and muscular, but maybe it's a little dull sounding. It doesn't really have the sheen. So we start to talk either in terms of flavors or colors, or let's even say body types.
It's getting fatter sounding. The terminology is, and where it gets especially complicated is when people are really sure that they understand what they're talking about. Something cold or having a cold?
Fat sound or a very thin sound.
Big, rich, brilliant.
Creamy and fat.
Scintillating as opposed to brash, because scintillating's got that little bit of a sparkle.
Not thin, but just doesn't have as many dimensions to the sound. It's funny to say, but it's not an exact science. At least under the ear, it sounds a little na. It just sounds like that to me under the ear.
One person says, that's a red rose. The other one says, yeah, piece of cake, that's a red rose. But then you show them a picture of a green rose, and one person says, yeah, that's a red rose. And the other one says, no, that's a green rose.
Mm-hmm. Are you getting much bright out of it?
Bright? Yeah, it's very bright for me. I would love it to be...
This is very bright?
Well...
So you have to be really sure that you're using the words, but also that you verify that those words really mean the same thing. I'm hearing things differently than what you're saying. So, I mean, this is typical for us to start off this way. And eventually the terminology will get to be the same.
Yes.
And that's where it gets really complicated, because as soon as it becomes other than black or white, gray is complicated.
Another aspect that I really look for is a certain kind of sweetness and lyricism to the sound, because like anything, I don't want to be in a conversation with someone who's shouting at me all the time. So I really look for other subtle qualities like sweetness of a sound, which I think are harder to pinpoint. And I think it's that combination that makes an interesting mix, rather than just categorically saying, I want a bright sound or I want a dark sound. It's learning to navigate between the sweet and the dark, the slightly wild and the tamed. So I try to honor, I know it sounds very mystical, but I try to honor what I think the violin wants to be first. And then from there, I try to imagine what its potential could be. What is this instrument trying to be? Who will it serve the best? And how does it want to be played? This is the kind of sound I prefer, but I could also see the other version being someone else's preference. I can't always replicate the same sound for every instrument. Number one, it's not possible. Number two, I think that'd be really boring because then we would end up, even if it were possible, to have the exact same violin come out of Terry's studio every time, which would not be desirable.
I like to think that all of my instruments have a certain familial sound, but they're like kids, you know, they've got their individual personalities, but they all look kind of weird because they're my kids, you know.
It requires, I think, a little bit of imagination that I like, because I look at this instrument and I think, this instrument is not supposed to be a powerhouse instrument. This instrument is supposed to be a much more sweet-talking, intimate kind of instrument.
It's, you know, plenty powerful, it's fast, it articulates well, and it is just now getting to the point of being, you know, is it that exact type of sound the person's looking for, or can they do what they are what they hope to do with the instrument?
Regine is, she's very open-minded, and she's interested in just about everything having to do with instruments. It really complicates things when you're not in one of the major metropolitan musical centers. And so I rely on building local relationships with people whose musical taste I trust and whose playing I respect.
Once the testing is complete, the instrument is ready to be delivered. This violin is for a client in Portland, Oregon.
The instrument itself is only, you know, the top, the back, they're only about 3 millimeters thick. And so wood is hygroscopic, so it means it really sucks up any moisture in the air. So the neck foot swells and it pushes the neck up a little bit, but the neck is hooked onto the fingerboard. The fingerboard ends up going down, but the bridge doesn't move. And so all of a sudden the strings, instead of being 2, 3, maybe 4 millimeters high, distance between the string and the fingerboard, you know, it can become, you know, 5, 6, 7, which makes it unplayable for the musician. Before I leave the shop, I have a bow with me that I travel with. And, you know, before digital, the most accurate hygrometers, it was just a horsehair. When the hair is exposed to moisture, it stretches. So it's really accurate. So I can set the bow before I leave town so the hair is just touching the stick. And then within a minute or two of arriving, open the case up, have a look at where the hair is, and I've got a really good idea of what kind of adjustment I'm going to have to do to the instrument to acclimatize it for the, you know, at least begin to get it ready for the musician.
I can go on and on about sort of the concrete markers of success, and yet he brings with it a refreshingly humble attitude.
The more I know, the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. And, you know, how much there is to learn still.
He respects the violin. He respects that he knows what he's doing, but there's always room for, not necessarily error, but room for the variable.
It's almost like you're dropping a kid off at college or something. I'm happy that it's getting into the hands of a musician, so it'll be used. But it's sort of a sad farewell.
You know, what other thing in your life, tool or whatever, do you have in such close contact for so many hours each day, and you rely on it for your career, and they appreciate and value? It seems like a win-win situation for everybody. It's great.